She had learned over the years that the most dangerous thing a woman like her could do was make powerful people feel comfortable enough to forget she was in the room. It was a skill honed across 11 years of service, a blade sharpened not on a whetstone, but on the daily grind of being looked through, talked past, and dismissed before she had finished her first sentence. Marguerite Voss had spent more than a decade building the kind of invisible competence that kept empires breathing. And the empire she kept breathing belonged to a man who could silence a room simply by opening a door. His name was Dorian Cash, and he was, by every external measure, the most frightening person in any room he entered. He was not frightening the way movie villains were frightening, with a snarl and a monologue. He was frightening the way a very calm sea is frightening to someone who knows what moves beneath its surface. He smiled with his mouth and held his eyes perfectly, terrifyingly still. He wore his authority like a second skin, and he ran the Kosh Syndicate, a privately held, extravagantly dangerous network of financial leverage, political influence, and consequences quietly administered, with the precision of a man who had never once lost track of a single thread in a very large, very lethal web. And Marguerite kept that web intact. She had come to him at 24 with a postgraduate degree in financial forensics and exactly one asset: an almost supernatural ability to see patterns in chaos, to read the architecture of deception the way other people read weather. She was not slender. She was not the kind of woman who stopped traffic on a sidewalk, not in the way the syndicate's usual orbit of women were designed to do. She was soft in body and iron in mind, with dark, heavy-lidded eyes that missed nothing, and a voice she kept deliberately low so that people leaned toward her rather than away. No one in Dorian Cash's world had ever thought to ask whether that was intentional. They should have. The Elstridge Gala was held in the ballroom of the Alderton Hotel every autumn, and it was less a charitable event than a census of power. Every major financial player in the city attended, along with a curated selection of politicians, judges, and the kind of quiet, soft-spoken men whose business cards listed nothing specific and who were worth, conservatively, the GDP of a small nation. It was a room in which alliances were confirmed, debts were recalled, and careers were ended between the appetizer and the main course. Dorian attended every year. This year, he brought Marguerite not as his operational director, which was her actual function and had been for 3 of the 11 years she had served him, but as his wife. They had been married for 8 months. Quietly, privately, in a ceremony attended by 4 people, none of whom were surprised, except perhaps Marguerite herself. The marriage had begun in the way many things between them began, with a practical conversation that turned, by degrees, into something that could no longer be described as practical at all. Dorian had said, with characteristic bluntness, that she was the only person he had ever trusted with everything, and that trust, in his world, was the only currency that mattered. He had said it standing at her office window at 11 o'clock at night, watching the city below, and she had answered after a long silence that she supposed that was the least romantic proposal she had ever heard. He had turned from the window then and looked at her in a way that had made the room feel very small. He had said, quietly, that he had not been proposing. He had been stating a fact, and the proposal, if she required one, was this: he could not imagine the rest of his life arranged by anyone else's hands, and he was not in the habit of imagining things he didn't intend to have. She had said yes. She had said yes, understanding exactly what she was entering, what it would cost her, and what it would not give her. She had said yes, knowing that the syndicate's world was full of women who were beautiful, The way rare objects are beautiful, collected and displayed and never truly known. She was not that. She knew she was not that. She had folded that knowledge into herself years ago and found to her own quiet satisfaction that she did not need to be. She had other forms of indispensable. But the Elstridge Gala, as it turned out, had opinions. The evening began with the kind of manufactured warmth that expensive rooms specialize in. Crystal caught the chandelier light and threw it in 1,000 directions. The air smelled of gardenias and old money and the faint metallic note of ambition. Dorian moved through the room in the way he always moved, unhurried, with the kinetic stillness of something designed to be apex. And Marguerite moved at his shoulder. Her dark velvet gown, the color of deep water, her posture, the kind that only comes from a woman who has made her peace with taking up space on her own terms. The first comment came from Raina Solter. Raina was the third wife of a currency arbitrage billionaire named Frederick Solter, and she was spectacular in the way certain artificial things are spectacular, entirely engineered and flawlessly maintained. She was perhaps 40, though she wore 30 on her face and performed 25 with her laugh. She had known Dorian in the particular way women like Raina knew men like Dorian, which is to say, she had once been a decorative presence at syndicate functions before Frederick's money had proved a more stable orbit, and she had never entirely let go of the idea that she and Dorian represented some kind of unfinished business. She said it to the cluster of 4 women standing near the floral arrangement by the east window, said it in the carrying whisper that is designed to be overheard by exactly the person it concerns. She looked at Marguerite across the 15 feet of marble floor and said with a bright and absolutely genuine smile that she supposed Dorian had always had unusual taste, and that it was sweet, really, the way some men developed a fondness for comfort over aesthetics once they reached a certain age. One of the women laughed. A second pressed her lips together in the universal gesture of someone enjoying something they know they should not enjoy. Marguerite heard every word. She did not react. This, too, was a skill. She let the words pass through her without changing her surface, the way deep water accepts a thrown stone and closes over it completely, leaving no record of the disturbance. She turned to the man on her left, a city comptroller who owed the syndicate 2 separate favors and who was consequently always delighted to see her, and she asked him a question about a municipal bond issuance that made him look briefly alarmed and then deeply grateful that she was apparently still speaking to him. Dorian, who had been 5 feet away conducting an exchange of pleasantries with a shipping magnate, went very still. She had not turned to look at him. She did not need to. She knew the quality of his stillness the way a seismologist knows the difference between minor tremors and something tectonic shifting in the deep. He did not address it. Not then. The evening continued. They moved through cocktails and through the formal seating arrangement which placed them at the center table as befitted Dorian's position and where Marguerite could observe, as she had been observing since the moment they arrived, that something at this gala was badly wrong. It was not the kind of wrong that announced itself. It was the kind she read in the pauses between sentences, in the way certain eyes slid towards certain other eyes across the room, in the conversation she had half heard in the corridor near the cloakroom while she was returning from a brief absence during cocktail hour. 2 men speaking quickly, not quietly enough. A name she recognized, a figure she recognized. A deadline she absolutely recognized because she had spent the last 3 weeks tracking the exact financial instrument it referred to through 4 shell companies and an offshore vehicle registered in a jurisdiction that officially did not cooperate with anyone. The figure was $22 million. The deadline was tonight, and the name attached to it belonged to a man currently sitting at their table. His name was Emil von Troost, and he had been Dorian's chief financial auditor for 6 years, which meant he had been Marguerite's professional counterpart for 3 of those, and which meant she knew his patterns better than he knew them himself. She had liked Emil in the distant, collegial way one likes a very good chess opponent. She had also noticed, 7 weeks ago, a sequence of entries in a reconciliation ledger that had a particular kind of wrongness to them, the wrongness of something very carefully constructed to look accidental, which is the most unnatural kind of wrong there is. She had said nothing to Dorian, not because she was uncertain, because she was certain, and certainty like this required complete proof before it became accusation. She had needed 3 more weeks. She had taken them. She had, during those 3 weeks, quietly and without authorization arranged for the $22 million in question to be rerouted through a secondary vehicle she controlled, freezing it in a position from which Emil's external contact could not access it without triggering an automated alert she had written herself. Tonight was the night Emil had promised delivery, which meant tonight was the night everything would surface. She excused herself from the table at 9:47, told Dorian she was going to find coffee strong enough to survive the evening's third speaker, and took her phone to a quiet anteroom off the main corridor. She made 2 calls. The first was to Aldrich, the syndicate's logistics director and the one person in the organization she had trusted with the partial shape of what she knew. The second was to a number she had assembled digit by digit from documents that had taken her 3 weeks to locate. And when the man on the other end answered with a name that wasn't his real one, she gave him the 6-character release code for the frozen account and then a different 6-character code immediately after, and explained in 40 seconds that the funds he was expecting were now stored somewhere. He would never find them, that the regulatory alert she could trigger from her phone in the next 60 seconds would result in his firm being investigated by 3 separate agencies before morning, and that his only path to anything resembling a future involved a full written disclosure delivered to her secure address within the hour of every communication he had ever had with Emil von Troost. The man on the other end of the call was silent for exactly 4 seconds. Then he asked how he could verify she was who she said she was. She gave him a 12-digit identifier that corresponded to a transaction he had believed was known only to himself, his account manager, and Emil. He began talking. She listened, committed everything to the precise and categorizing archive of her memory, thanked him, and ended the call. Then she sat for a moment in the anteroom with the phone in her hands and the sounds of the Gala's string quartet filtering through the closed door, a bright, festive sound that belonged to a different world than the one she was currently operating in, and she breathed once, slowly, and allowed herself exactly 5 seconds of the particular satisfaction that comes not from victory, but from having been right. Then she stood, smoothed the dark velvet of her gown, and went back to find coffee. She was 2 minutes from the anteroom when the Gala's tenor changed. She heard it before she saw it, the specific pitch shift that a room full of powerful people produces when something has gone wrong and everyone is pretending simultaneously that it has not. She walked faster. When she came through the main doors back into the ballroom, she saw Dorian standing near the east windows, and he was not pretending. He stood, with his hands clasped at his back, and 2 men she recognized as rival syndicate figures from the northern accounts were positioned in a way that read, to anyone who knew how to read it, as an attempt at physical intimidation. One of them, a broad and expensively tailored figure named Gareth Moore, had apparently decided that Dorian's evening could be made useful to him. The northern accounts had a grievance, and it was the kind of grievance that, lubricated by alcohol and the false security of a public venue, had apparently seemed like a good idea to air directly. He was saying something about obligations. He was saying it with the careful calm of a man who knows that the words he is saying have a blade in them. Dorian's face was the face he wore when his patience had calcified into something else entirely, and the two men had not yet realized that the face they were reading as restrained was the face he wore in the seconds before restraint became an academic question. Marguerite crossed the room. She did it without hurry, without drama, moving at the pace of someone who belongs exactly where she is going. And she arrived at Dorian's shoulder, and she said, addressing Gareth Moore directly and without preface, that she understood the northern accounts had concerns about the Dressler vehicle allocation, and that those concerns were legitimate, but that the structure they were based on had been amended 14 days ago under a revision she had filed with the syndicate's oversight board, a revision that increased the northern share by a figure she named precisely, and which she could demonstrate from memory corresponded exactly to the adjustment Gareth had been requesting through the proper channels since the previous March. Gareth Moore looked at her. He looked at her the way men like him look at women like her, with a momentary blankness, a recalibration, and then a tightening around the eyes that meant he had just heard something inconvenient spoken with a precision he could not argue. He said that he was not aware of that revision. She said, pleasantly, that he would find the filing reference on his oversight board notification, which would have been delivered to his registered address on the 12th, and that if he had not received it, that was worth investigating, but that the revision itself was binding and documented, and she was happy to send a summary to his office in the morning if that would be useful. There was a pause. Gareth Moore and his associate exchanged a look that contained an entire recalibration of the evening's planned trajectory. Then Gareth said, with the particular grace of a man who has decided to save his face by accepting the exit being offered to him, that he would review the filing and that he appreciated the clarity. He nodded. His associate nodded. They withdrew. Dorian did not move. He watched them go with those perfectly still eyes, and then he turned and looked at Marguerite, and the look was the one she had seen from him only rarely in 11 years, the look that meant his internal architecture had just shifted on its foundations without his permission. He said nothing. She said she was still looking for the coffee, and did he want any? He said her name, just that. The way he said it landed differently than anything else he might have said, not with surprise, not with praise, but with something that sounded, to a woman who had spent 11 years learning to read the precise frequency of Dorian Cash's silences, like a man arriving, for the first time, somewhere he should have been for a long time. She looked at him steadily and waited. He said quietly that she had known about Moore. She said she had noted the escalation pattern in his channel communications about 3 weeks ago, yes. He said, still in that low and very controlled voice, that she had not told him. She said she had not had enough verified to tell him anything worth hearing until she did, and that when she did, she had addressed it. He looked at her for a long moment. The string quartet was playing something Viennese and unaware. Around them, the Elstridge Gala continued its careful performance of civility, and in the middle of it, Dorian Cash stood very still and looked at his wife, the way a man looks at something he has carried for years without understanding its weight. He said very quietly that there was something else she was not telling him. She considered this. She considered the 22 million, the anteroom calls, the disclosure en route to her secure address, the frozen account, the 3 weeks of careful, undisclosed investigation. She considered the precise moment at which the operationally correct time to tell him had arrived. She concluded that the moment was approximately now. She told him. She told him in 45 seconds, standing near the east windows of the Alderton Hotel ballroom, with the chandelier light catching the dark velvet of her gown and the sound of conversation and crystal around them, and she watched his face while she told him, which was something very few people had survived doing. His face was not blank. It moved through something she did not have a name for, not in the years of observation she had accumulated. It moved through recognition and something harder, and something beneath that which was not professional at all. He said Emil's name once, quietly, in a tone that resolved any question about what Emil's immediate future contained. Then he said, "You have the disclosure document." She said it was incoming to her secure address and should arrive within the hour. He said, still in that low, controlled voice, that she had conducted a full counterintelligence operation within his organization on her own authority over a 3-week period and resolved it. She said she had had reason to believe that telling him earlier would have prompted an action that foreclosed the documentary evidence she needed to make the case airtight, and that she had made a judgment call, and that she would understand if he had thoughts about that. He looked at her. He said, "I have thoughts about that." He said, "None of them are about the judgment call." The evening's final scene of public consequence came just after the dessert service, in the moment when the Elstridge Gala's organizing committee traditionally called each table's principal figure to stand and be acknowledged before the assembled room. It was a formality, a performance of hierarchy, and every year Dorian stood, and the room acknowledged him, and it meant precisely what it always meant in rooms like this, which was that power recognized power. This year, as the committee chair moved through the tables, Reina Soltaire chose the moment to perform a second act. She said something to the women at her table, something that produced laughter, and she glanced toward Dorian's table in a way that made the direction of the joke perfectly clear. It was a small cruelty, the kind that powerful rooms specialize in, small enough to be deniable, precise enough to land exactly where intended. The laughter carried. Dorian, who had been still since Marguerite had told him everything in 45 seconds at the east window, turned his head toward the sound. He located its source with the efficiency of a man who tracks threats professionally. He held his gaze on Reina Solter for 3 seconds. 3 seconds in Dorian Kash's gaze was a geological event. Reina Solter's laughter stopped. He stood, as the protocol required when his table was acknowledged, and the committee chair began the usual words about significant community contribution, and Dorian raised a hand in the minimal acknowledgement the gesture required. And then he did something that Dorian Cash had never, in 11 years of Elstridge Galas and every other room in which power displayed itself, done before. He extended his hand to Marguerite, not in the way of assistance, not in the patronizing way of a man helping a woman to her feet. He extended it the way a general presents a victor to the assembled field, with the full weight of his deliberate attention, palm up, absolute in its invitation. She looked at his hand. She looked at him. She placed her hand in his and rose, and he turned to the room with her hand in his and said, in a voice that did not require amplification because it was the voice of a man who had never needed to raise it, that the room's indulgence was requested for a correction to the usual protocol. The room went very quiet. He said that for 11 years, the syndicate's most operationally significant function had been performed by one person without sufficient acknowledgement, and that this evening that function had included, among its other unremarkable accomplishments, the identification and containment of a significant internal financial breach that he would be addressing with full consequences before the week was out, and that he wished the room to understand, with perfect clarity, who they were actually dealing with when they dealt with the Cash organization. He said, "This is Marguerite Cash. She is the reason anything in this room tonight still holds its value. I suggest you treat her accordingly." The room was completely silent for 2 seconds. Then the city comptroller, who owed 2 favors and was keenly alive to the direction of prevailing winds, began to applaud. The applause spread. Gareth Moore, after a fractional delay, applauded. Reina Soltaire's hands came together in the automatic motion of someone who has understood, very suddenly, the depth of the mistake they have made. Marguerite stood in the chandelier light of the Alderton Hotel ballroom with her hand in Dorian's and received the attention of every powerful person in the room, and she did not smile the way one smiles from relief or gratitude. She smiled the way she had always moved through rooms, with the quiet and absolute composure of a woman who had never required the room's approval and did not require it now, but who could see very clearly that she finally had it, and that this time it was going to stay. The disclosure document arrived at her secure address at 11:14 that night. It was thorough. The man on the other end of her earlier call had understood his situation with admirable clarity, and the document he provided named every communication, every transfer instruction, every back-channel arrangement Emile von Troost had made with 3 separate external parties over the course of 19 months. It named the accounts. It named the amounts. It named the dates, which cross-referenced against the syndicate's internal records with the precision of something that had been very carefully constructed and that was now, with equal precision, entirely disassembled. Aldrich received the document from Marguerite's forwarded copy at 11:22 and confirmed, in the terse numerical shorthand they had used for 3 years, that the secondary vehicle was locked, the alerts suppressed, and the external party's relevant access revoked in full. Emile von Troost was contacted at 11:40. Marguerite was not present for that contact. She did not need to be. She had done what needed to be done, and the consequences that followed were Dorian's to administer. She was standing at the window of their hotel suite, still in the dark velvet gown with her shoes off and a glass of water in her hand, when he came in. He stood in the doorway for a moment. He had the look he carried after a night that had cost him something, not the operational cost, not the professional reckoning with a trusted person's betrayal, but something internal, the cost of a recalculation long overdue. She did not turn from the window. She said, "How is he?" He said, "Handled." And then he said, "That isn't what I want to talk about." She turned then and looked at him across the room. The suite was quiet and warm, the city laid out beyond the glass in its indifferent glitter. He crossed to where she stood, and he stopped at a distance that was close and deliberate, and he looked at her the way he had looked at her at the east window, except that the something she had not had a name for had clarified itself into something she could now read without ambiguity. He said, 11 years. She said, yes. He said, slowly, as if he were constructing something carefully, I have spent 11 years with the most extraordinary person I have ever known, and for 8 of those years I let this organization treat you as a function rather than a person, and I did not correct it, and that is something I'm going to have to live with. She was quiet for a moment. She said, you married me. He said, I married you because I finally ran out of ways to pretend that what I needed from you was professional. She looked at him. He said, what I'm telling you is that I was wrong, that I was blind in the specific way that people who think they see everything are blind, by looking at what is obvious and missing what matters, and that you never, not once, required my recognition in order to be exactly what you were, and I find that I cannot reconcile that with how long you went without it. She set the glass of water down on the window ledge. She said, in a voice that was steady and low, and the voice she used when she meant exactly what she was saying with nothing in reserve, I did not need the room to see me, but I will tell you that I have wanted you to see me clearly for a very long time. He said, I know, and I am sorry it took me this long, and I am aware that an apology is a very small accounting for 11 years. She said, then we can consider it a down payment. Something in him, some last braced thing released. He reached up and touched her face with a care that was entirely at odds with everything the room full of powerful people had just seen from him, entirely at odds with every calculation and consequence and cold decision of the 11 years preceding it. He touched her face the way you touch something you have finally understood the value of and cannot believe you held so carelessly. He said her name again, the way he had said it at the east window. Only now there was nothing left unspoken in it. In the weeks that followed, the consequences arranged themselves with the precision Marguerite had built into them. Emil von Trost's departure from the syndicate was documented and legally formalized in a manner that ensured he would spend the next several years in close conversation with regulatory bodies and would not, under any terms she had written into the arrangement, touch a financial instrument larger than a personal checking account. The three external parties named in the disclosure document faced outcomes commensurate with their level of participation. The $22 million was reconciled back into the syndicate's legitimate vehicles with documentation that Marguerite prepared herself, audit-ready and precise, and which she filed with a notation that the recovery was complete and the vulnerability closed. Aldrich, who had been the only person with any part of the picture before the night of the gala, received a formal elevation in his operational designation, something Marguerite requested and Dorian authorized without discussion, because they had, by that point, the kind of marital efficiency in professional matters that comes from 11 years of already functioning as a unit before they had the title for it. The syndicate's internal structure was reorganized under new terms that Marguerite designed from first principles and Dorian signed into operational authority, terms that formalized her role not as a supporting function but as the organization's co-principal, her decisions binding with his, her authority in financial matters absolute and unreviewable by any tier beneath them. This was not announced. It did not need to be. The people who needed to know understood within 48 hours through the precise mechanism by which things are always understood in organizations like this one. A single, quiet conversation in which the terms of the new reality were stated without elaboration, and no one in the room chose to express confusion. Gareth Moore's Northern accounts received the revised Dressler allocation they had been requesting since March, formalized under the amendment Marguerite had filed and delivered to him in writing with a cover note from her, not from Dorian, that thanked him for his patience. He replied with a brevity that suggested a man who had decided to invest heavily in being on the right side of the Koch organization going forward. Reina Soltaire's husband, Frederick, received, through a channel he would never be able to trace back to any source he could name, a detailed summary of 3 financial positions he had been carrying at a risk level he had not fully understood, accompanied by a suggested rebalancing strategy that, if followed, would save him a figure well into 8 digits over the following fiscal year. He followed it. He was profoundly grateful in the vague way of men who receive gifts from anonymous benefactors and choose not to examine the gift's genealogy too closely. He did not know where it came from. Reina did not know either. But Reina was a woman of particular intelligence beneath the engineered exterior, and she understood, in the way that mattered, that she had been shown the shape of a power she had catastrophically underestimated, and that the grace being extended to her husband was a message written in a language she was only now learning to read. She sent flowers to the Koch residence, gardenias. The card said simply, "With my respect," and she meant it. Marguerite placed the flowers in the window of her office. 11 years and 8 months ago, she had walked into a syndicate-adjacent building in the business district at 7 in the morning, carrying a file she had prepared that no one had asked for, but that she had known was needed, because she had seen the gap it was designed to fill, and she did not leave gaps unfilled. She had been 24. She had been carrying 40 extra pounds that no one in the room would look past, and a mind that could read the architecture of a financial deception in 14 seconds, and a composure that did not require an audience. The man she now called her husband had looked at the file. He had looked at her. He had said, in the tone of a man who does not praise easily and so has a rating scale that begins at acceptable and ends at exceptional. This is exceptional. Who sent you? She had said. I sent myself. He had paused. He had said, then sit down. She had sat down. She had stayed for 11 years. She had quietly, steadily, without fanfare or acknowledgement, kept his empire breathing while the world his empire contained looked past her and through her and over her, and never once thought to wonder what it would look like if she stopped. She had never stopped. Not because he had seen her, not because the world he inhabited had seen her, because she had never needed the seeing to know what she was worth. She had known since she was 24, and walking through a door, she had opened for herself exactly what she brought to any room she entered, and she had brought it every day with the kind of consistency that doesn't require applause because it is not performing. It simply is. But she sat in her office now on an afternoon in early November with the gardenias in the window and the city doing its indifferent commerce below. And she thought about the east windows of the Alderton Hotel and the way he had said her name and the way he had touched her face. And she allowed herself a thing she had not allowed very often in 11 years, which was the simple, uncomplicated acknowledgement that being seen by the right person who sees you completely and without revision and without the need to make you smaller is not weakness. It is the rarest thing there is. Dorian came to the doorway of her office at 4:30. He did this more often now, not with requests or operational items, but simply, she understood, because he was in the process of correcting an 11-year habit of not doing it. He stood in the doorway with his hands in his pockets and looked at her in the way he had now, the way of a man who has recalibrated what he cannot afford to miss. He said, "The gardenias," she said, "from Raina Salter." He looked at them. He said, "That's an interesting development." She said, "People are usually interesting when they finally understand what they're looking at." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in the low, direct way, he said, the things that mattered. "You have been looking at me for 11 years, and I have been looking at everything in the room except the thing most worth looking at. I would like, going forward, to do that differently." She looked up from her desk. She looked at him in the doorway, this man who was dangerous and controlled and had once been the most frightening thing in every room, who was now in the doorway of her office on a November afternoon, simply a man making a deliberate effort at honesty with the person he could not afford to keep at arm's length. She said, "You're doing better." He said, "I intend to keep doing better." She said, "I know. That's why I'm still here." The city went about its business below them. The gardenias opened in the window's light, and in the Koch Syndicate's center of operational gravity, which had always been this office and this woman and the 11 years of tireless and unacknowledged work that kept everything running, something settled into the arrangement it should have had from the beginning, not changed exactly, seen at last clearly without obstruction by eyes that would not look away again. That was enough. That was, in the end, everything.